Today is the 7th of December, and this is the anniversary, excuse me. My tongue gets tied when I do this. Anyway, this is the anniversary of when our republic was attacked by Japan in 1941. What we call Pearl Harbor Day was a significant turning point in our constitutional history. As a macro historian, I always try to look at the big picture. Consequently, FDR needed an attack on the U.S. to get us into war. There's plenty of books that expose this. There's plenty of empirical data that talks about why FDR harassed and basically taunted the Japanese and the Germans to try to get us to get them to attack us. The entire world at this point in time was adopting communistic ideologies since the last World War that Woodrow Wilson got us into. And here in America, the U.S. was on socialism steroids. Again, this is during FDR's time. And those socialism steroids, known as the New Deal, to inch us closer towards communism, was on this unstoppable path until these two deviants kind of upset the communist apple cart towards the end of the 30s. This is when Hitler and Germany rose and adopted a fascist form of communism. Most people like to think that the Nazis were on the right side of politics, but actually they were on the far left, because the first thing that Hitler did was he disbanded the Republic and nationalized everything. He started nationalizing medicine, and he actually nationalized religion. He was a huge communist in nationalizing things. But anyway, he was on conquest to take over Europe. The other deviant was Japan. They were a lot different, though. This was an empire-seeking conquest and broadening their empire. They weren't necessarily looking for a communist form of government. To the elitists in the 30s, and actually the elitists over time, who were trying to propel the world into the Woodrow Wilson's failed fantasy known as the League of Nations and global governance, they needed stability to begin bringing all countries into a world banking forum. Let me take a quick aside. Just like what was going on with Europe and trying to create the euro and the economic union of Europe, they needed stability. So we, as a matter of fact, under President Clinton, he injected forces to go in there to help stabilize and help entrench Islam into a good entry point into Europe. And so, this is all a part of the big progressive push and the big progressive move towards global governance. But anyway, let me get back to my train of thought. And as a matter of fact, before I get back to my train of thought, here's another aside. One may want to look up the Venona Project and the global banking of the time. And we're talking about the global banking efforts of the 40s and even the 30s and so forth. If you go back to Jekyll Island and the Federal Reserve and what the Rothschilds and the Rothschild banking system was trying to create, they were definitely moving towards a global bank and trying to create a global finance and global governance. It's kind of like all the utopian books coming true. Well, anyway, even though many of these big countries were already moving towards or into these global banks, there were the rest that needed to be brought in, and that's why they needed the stability. Anyway, from the global depression, because when we went into the collapse of 1929, the global depression, it wasn't just a U.S. depression. Germany was in the throes of depression. Theirs was different. But everybody was in the throes of depression. Even Russia, Stalin starved millions of people because they couldn't grow food, or the way they were managing the pricing and production, he was killing people. So there was a lot of oppression and depression going on in the 30s, going into the 40s. So these two despots, these two deviants, exploited the opportunity and sought to expand their empires and or their boundaries. FDR and the world's elite felt it paramount that we enter the war. They did not believe Russia alone could win a dual front war. So FDR harassed, as we know, and I've said before, that he harassed both Germany and Japan to attack. And he got what he needed, thus today's anniversary. So I'll let the annals of history kind of report this, and there's all sorts of really good books. One of my favorite is an obscure one called The Unseen Hand. Or you could read my book. I talk about it, but I really don't get into the histories of wars. I get more into the ideology and the macro perspective. More importantly, FDR was able to give communism a test run here in the U.S., and I don't think most people are aware of the fact that we were living under a fascist and a communistic state. Now, it wasn't hard fascism, but the fact is that what FDR did was an egregious violation to the Constitution when he took us into the war. If you know someone who went through and lived through World War II, and they can remember, in other words, they don't have Alzheimer's or what have you, they actually have cognitive abilities, you may want to ask them what it was like here in the United States. Ask your parents maybe, or your grandparents or your great-grandparents about ration cards. Ask them about products not being available, such as tires, cars. I mean, just fundamental products that, we would consider fundamental today. Or, as I said, food and so forth. Ask them about the propaganda patrols at the theaters and the public events and how the news was controlled and distributed. You can also ask them about the Blue Eagle and what that represented during that Depression and during the war time frame when FDR ramped up his globalist, or not his globalist, but his communist testing here in the United States. Americans surrendered their rights and privileges, freedoms, and their liberty because we were attacked. It is interesting what we're willing to do when we are reduced to primal emotions such as fear and anger. As long as a barrage of asides, as long as I'm talking about this, I've got this barrage of asides on the rations and confiscations and so forth. And so if you think about it, and I'll take this little tangent here, what is the free market? Most people go, well, that's what we have today. Actually, no, the free market is where, and actually during FDR's time, the free market was forced to come out, and it was what we would call today the black market. What we have today in our market space is a heavily regulated market that, has everybody's fingers in your pocket, from the U.S. government, our general government, to the states, to the counties and local and so forth. Everybody has their fingers in your pocket to some degree in trying to make some money so that they can govern us better. Bottom line, that's our market today. But during FDR's time and this barrage of asides, if we just look at the rations, nobody could just go out and buy beef. Nobody could just go and buy sugar or butter, what we would consider staples, flour and so forth. What would happen is you were allowed to only buy so much for a certain period of time, and then you couldn't buy anymore. And the retailers, or I should say the grocery stores or the merchants, they held that line, because if they got caught, they would get in trouble. They would not just get in trouble. They wouldn't get their hands spanked. They would literally go to jail. And it was not tolerated, and zero tolerance policy towards anybody that violated these policies, or I should say these cards, these ration cards. There was this confiscation of production and services. Ask them about this. There was literally a period of time for a couple of years you couldn't even buy a car. The car manufacturers stopped producing cars for people because they were directed by the government, and their means of production was seized just so that they could ramp up the mass production of our armaments to fight the war. Even if a company wanted to use resources to sell cars and what have you, they were not allowed. In addition, there was a confiscation of services, and the Blue Eagle was the representation of government compliance. In other words, if you ran a store and you were selling products or a service, and your products were matching what the government dictated that service or good should talk about. So remember, a free market, the price is based on supply and demand. Well, at this point in time, the prices were set by government.